All right, Isaiah 42, and may we never forget that God is amazing. In this chapter that we want to call, or at least I'd like to call, purpose, understanding that it primarily seems to devote the first few verses to talking about the Christ himself in words that are literally going to describe God's servant. In some verses that are going to be quoted again in the New Testament, I believe by Jesus himself. I'll double check that, and God willing, posted above. But in those first few verses talking about his servant, it's roughly going to break down the first 7 verses specifically talking about the servant, and the last 2 verses, verses 8 and 9 of that first section, talking about God. The next set of verses going from roughly 10 through 16 are going to talk about the way in which he is calling his people to sing to him a new song, with the last section, verses 17 through the end of the chapter, verse 25, it seems, talking about the way in which his people need a servant like the one described here in the first few verses of chapter 42, because of the way in which they have declined in their fundamental understanding of their own purpose, or fundamentally pretty much anything around them. They are misinterpreting the times and the things going on in their lives. But breaking the chapter down a little bit more, I guess distinctly, the first few verses I'm just going to read because they are super famous, or at least familiar to the things that I was told growing up. Verse 1, "Behold, my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry out or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law." Get the recurring theme that his sense of purpose seems linked to his sense of justice. Understanding that, going on from there, we'll skip down to verses 8 and 9, like we said, where God begins to talk about himself in relationship to his servant. He will say, "I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them." Going back to that concept we saw before of his challenge to the idols as he laid out the case for himself and his true identity as God versus the idols who actually can perform no legitimate works whatsoever. One of the things he challenged them to do was tell the future. And that is one of the things he is using now to distinguish himself from the idols that he will go back to talking about at the end of the chapter, where in the meantime, he will call them, as we mentioned in verses 10 through 16, to sing a new song, calling them together, kind of itemizing those he is calling to sing the new song, roughly verses 10 through 12, where he is going to call them then to acknowledge his characteristics, likening himself in verse 13 to a mighty man or a man of war, talking about in some ways his patience in verse 14, talking about for a long time, however, he has held his peace, not simply flexing his strength at any opportunity, but waiting for the right time to, as he will go on through the end of that section, verses 15 and 16, to describe the way in which he has waited to accomplish the works that seem to be consistent with the way in which he has called his servant in a verse we skipped over in the first section, verse 6, where he says, "I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness." The song itself seeming to represent some of the deeds that are consistent with the righteousness in which he is called his servant. However, in contrast, as we said, verse 17 is going to compare his works in justice and righteousness to the emptiness of the idols. Verse 17 saying, "They are turned back and utterly put to shame who trust in carved idols, who say to metal images, 'You are gods.'" The net effect of their idolatry being described in a way that in some ways may be reminiscent of Psalms 115 and 135 that talked about the way in which serving false gods, or gods that were no gods at all, eventually reduced the people to reasoning on the level of those blocks of wood or metal or whatever they were crafting. Over time, they were losing their ability to reason with much less godly wisdom, even the fundamental human wisdom with which God had blessed them, eventually seeming to get to the point where they lacked what we grew up calling common sense, understanding that by the end of the chapter, they are lacking the ability to create the or make the causal connection between the things that they were doing and the consequences God was allowing them to suffer. Once again, seemingly reminiscent of the earliest warnings that we saw in the book of Isaiah. This chapter presenting the problem that some might describe as being a super preachable passage, meaning there's so many points that seem to connect with where I'm at this point in my life that it's hard to focus on just one or two things. But of all the things that seemed to speak to me out of this chapter, the one that might have caught my attention most was that early on reference that we pointed out where Jesus, or the servant, has a strong sense of purpose, understanding the way in which he has come to establish justice on the earth. Specifically, concluding in verse 4 of that section, he will not grow faint or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth. Understanding the way in which Paul is going to write to the Romans in what we call Romans chapter 12, that believers should not be conformed to the world, but transformed by the renewing of our minds. One of the greatest pressures to conform may not actually come from non-believers, but from believers who would choose to make the gospel something that it flat out is not. Maintaining a form of godliness while subtly altering its purpose, which is super similar to another New Testament passage warning about maintaining a form of godliness while denying its actual power. This chapter, Isaiah 42, reminding me of the way in which the servant seems to tap into his true strength, and that is, at least in part, refusing to water down the purpose that God gave him, which, beyond simply being a good servant, allowed him to avoid the eventual future of those who simply had a form of godliness. Those whose watered down purpose led them into a watered down understanding of the problems God was trying to help them avoid.